Psalm 107, verse 29 through 31 says, He calms the storms so that its waves are still quiet. Then they are glad because they are quiet. So he guides them to their desired haven. I don't know why, but we believers love something about storms. We use them metaphorically and literally when talking about them. But I think what it is about storms that we love so much to use to symbolize maybe bad times is that they range from mildly inconvenient to absolutely devastating. We could think of rain ruining your picnic or a tornado ruining your town, right? They range. Okay. And there's something about storms that when they happen, they change what we value. They make us come out of our comfort zone. And when we pick up on the Apostle Paul in verse 27, he is going to face a storm and a shipwreck. That is going to, I hope, show us all that despite the storms that we face in our lives, despite the happenings, that God is still with us. And through chapter 27, we will see that God was still with Paul. Because in chapter 26, at the end, he's facing trial with King Agrippa. It says in verse 31, and when they had left, they talked with each other and said, "This man is not doing anything to deserve death or imprisonment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been released if he had not appealed to Caesar." We know in his last trial, he essentially spends most of the time preaching the gospel as his defense. And they really don't find anything on him. And in fact, he says, I would have let you go, but you appealed to Caesar, so to Caesar you go. See, Paul had a mission long before that trial. And his mission was based on a promise that God had made to him, that he would go and preach in Rome. And this mission is coming true. He is headed to Rome. However, he is not heading to Rome as a preacher. He is heading to Rome as a prisoner. Not quite what one would have in mind. A very mildly inconvenient. So if you'll turn to Acts chapters 27, verse 1 with me, we'll read through the chapter together. When it was decided that we were to sail to Italy, they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion named Julius of the imperial regiment. When we had boarded a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, intended to sail to ports along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. Verse 3. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to receive their care. Let's pause there for a second. So Paul is handed over to this centurion named Julius, right? And what a centurion is in charge of over 100 men. And a centurion is known as somebody who is straightforward, honest, good character, completely disciplined, and a great leader. The Romans were better at picking their military leaders than they were at picking their political leaders. And in the New Testament, Jesus meets a centurion, doesn't he? And that centurion comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, can you heal my servant? And Jesus tells him, hey, I'll come to your house. And he says, no, I know, because I'm a centurion, I'm a leader, I know that you can heal him right where we're at. You say the word, and my servant is healed. And Jesus says, I've not found a man of greater faith in all of Jerusalem than this centurion here. And I mentioned how centurions were very disciplined. All of Romans soldiers had to be disciplined, had to carry out their task just as it had been told. And that's how they were able to conquer so much. It wasn't just the power that they had, but the military leadership and the ability to carry out the commands as it was exactly given. If a centurion didn't follow their commands exactly as it was given, he would be put to death. Now, why am I telling you this? Because Julius is a centurion, and Paul is a prisoner. And they are on their way, and they're traveling, right? But they make a stop, don't they? And Julius, it says in 3, the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to receive their care. The centurion is allowing Paul, to go, leave him for a little bit, visit his friends, have them take care of him, spend time, encourage him, and then just saying, hey, when you're done, come back to the boat. He's not just putting his job on the line if Paul escapes. He's putting his life on the line. So this speaks to not only Julius's character, but Paul's character as well, as that when he was still a prisoner, he earned the trust of the very people that captured him, that held him captive and prisoner. Verse 4. When we had put out to sea from there, we sailed along the northern coast of Cyprus because the winds were against us. After sailing through the open sea off Sicilia and Pamphylia, we reached Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. So they switched ships. Sailing slowly for many days with difficulty, we arrived off Cnidus. Since the wind did not allow us to approach it, we sailed along the south side of Crete off Salmon. So they're staying very close to the coast because the ship that they are in does not allow them to sail against the wind. They got to go with it. Okay? They're not in the greatest boat. With still more difficulty, we sailed along the coast and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lycia. So now they're in Fair Havens. By now, much time had passed, and the voyage was already dangerous. Since the Day of Atonement was already over, Paul gave his advice and told them, "Men, I can see that this voyage is headed towards disaster and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Something that I learned about Paul and why he's able to speak up so much is that he had already been in three different boat crashes. So he has experience not only, and he travels a lot. He's got not only experience traveling, but he's also got experience with disaster. And around the time that they're sailing into this, it's not the greatest weather for it. And he knows this. And Paul just gave his advice. He says, we're going to suffer heavy loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives, if we do this. It says, but the centurion paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than to what Paul said. This is a moment that I learned the greatest lesson in this, probably in this whole thing that spoke to me this moment right here. Not the centurion's good decisions or his good character, but his ability to make a bad decision. And this one, he made all the good decisions up until this point, probably. But this one bad decision that's his to make, he's in control here. And Paul shares his advice, and then he makes this bad decision anyway. So why did he make it? It says in verse 12, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter, and the majority decided to set sail from there, hoping somehow to reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete facing southwest and northwest, and winter there. Paul was telling him, we need to stay here. And they're saying, we don't like it here. We want to go to Phoenix for the winter, where it's much better for us. They made this terrible decision in the pursuit of comfort in the pursuit of what they saw as security, in ignoring all warnings, ignoring all the bad weather, ignoring all the advice, they went in pursuit of Phoenix and pleasure. So what happens next? It says, when a gentle south wind sprang up, they thought they had achieved their purpose. They weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. But before long, a fierce wind called the northeaster rushed down from the island. Since the ship was caught and unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. So they now, because of this northeastern storm, don't have control over the ship. They just have to go where they go. Mm-hmm. 16. After running under the shelter of a little island called Cauda, we were barely able to get control of the skiff. After hoisting it up, they used ropes and tackle and girded the ship. Fearing they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the drift anchor, and in this way they were driven along. Because we were being severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo the next day. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Now, their priorities and their values shift, don't they? Whatever they were shipping before, whatever they had, the tables, the chairs, anything they could throw over to just keep balance, to keep weight, to keep this thing floating, to keep alive. Now they suddenly want to do whatever it takes to stay alive. They don't care how much it costs. They don't care how much trouble they're going to get in when they come with that ship. They don't care about getting paid for the delivery of what they've had to throw over. They're just going to throw it over because their life means more to them than their comfort, but only in their moment of distress. That was on the third day. For many days, neither sun nor stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope was fading that we would be saved. When all hope was lost, see, if they need the stars to navigate, they need the wind, but they're not getting that, and they can't see the stars, then they can't navigate. They're running out of food. And I can tell you many times of the metaphorical storms in my life where I felt completely hopeless. So I know how they feel. And as you obviously know about the lack of details in the boats, that I know nothing about boats. I'm not even going to sit up here and pretend. So if I was on here and they were saying, hey, look, we're not going to make it, that would be my assumption as well. Complete and utter hopelessness. As I had put my trust in the crew and the leaders. But verse 21 says, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, you men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss. Now I urge you to take courage, because there will be no loss any of your lives, but only of the ship. For last night, an angel of the God I belong to and serve stood by me and said, "Don't be afraid, Paul. It is necessary for you to appear before Caesar. And indeed, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. So take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way it was told to me. But we have to run aground on some island." So when all hope is lost, Paul goes from prisoner to captain. And he says something that also spoke out to me. He said, "I told you so. I told you this was going to happen, and you ignored me." Then he goes on to say, "But the gracefulness of God." But the gracefulness of God. How many times when we're pointing out the sins of people, do we stop at that first part? It's very easy to do, isn't it? It's very easy to point out the sins of other people, the wrongdoings, how they are, to cast that judgment, and think, there's no hope for you. And he very well could have too. He had every reason to. But you see, there's grace. And people get kind of confused with grace. They get it mixed up. They think that grace is allowing people to do bad things and just forgiving them for it, right? Like they do bad, they say, "I'm sorry," and then they're forgiven. Part of it. But that's not the definition of a biblical grace. Grace is the ability to make things right, to do things the right way. It's not the avoidance of consequences. These guys are getting exactly what they deserved. No doubt about it. They chose this. This isn't some divine magical storm. This is logical. This is what happens when you do something, when you sail in the winter time when you're not supposed to. This is exactly what's going to happen to you. But God is giving them the ability to make it right. For last night, in verse 23, an angel of the Lord God I belonged to and served stood by me and said, "Don't be afraid, Paul. It is necessary for you to appear before Caesar." The plan, remember, to go to Rome. "And indeed, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you. So take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way it was told to me. But we have to run aground on some island." When we are correcting people and guiding them and discipling them, praying for them, hoping for them. We cannot just point out their sins. We also have to point them to the right way. And you may not know the right way, but God does. We can point them to God, and we can pray for them. And that's what he's doing. Take courage, because I believe in God. Verse 27. When the 14th night came, we were drifting in the Adriatic Sea, and about midnight the sailors thought they were approaching land. They took soundings and found it to be 120 feet deep. When they had sailed a little farther and sounded again, they found it to be 90 feet deep. Then, fearing we might run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come. Some sailors tried to escape from the ship. They had let down the skiff into the sea, pretending that they were going to put out anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ships, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut the ropes holding the skiff and let it drop away. In their moments of crisis and shipwreck and storm, they're still trying to save themselves. They're still not trusting Paul. When it was about daylight, Paul urged them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing. So I urge you to take some food, for this is for your survival, since none of you will lose a hair from your head." After he said these things and had taken some bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. And after he broke it, he began to eat. They all were encouraged and took food themselves. In all, there were 276 of us on the ship. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. Let me remind you that Paul is a prisoner who is not responsible for any of these people. They are the ones who hold him captive. But in that moment of captivity, he's still serving them, still encouraging them to hold on to the promises of God. He's still reminding them of the promise, hey, I was promised by God that I'm getting to Rome and that everybody on this ship is coming with me. And it's through that servitude that they started to let go of more of their values, their grain. If they don't arrive with that grain, they don't get paid. They don't get any money. The whole trip, the whole disaster was a complete waste of time. But it didn't matter in this moment. Oh my, how the storm, the very shipwreck, is pointing them all to what really matters, which is faith in God, because it's the only thing that's keeping them alive. It's Paul's faith in God and your very life. Not money, because it can't even help you right now. not technology, because that failed you, not the ship that we're on, because it's inevitably going down. Everything you put your hope in before, every plan that you had is failing. And all that's left is the grace of God. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted a bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could. After cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach. But they struck a sandbar and ran into the ship aground. The boat jammed fast and remained immovable, while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape. This very moment right here is where we are going to see the grace of God. Because the ship crashes into this beach, which gives prisoners more of an ability to escape. And if they escape, all the men who are responsible, the centurions and the guards, will be put to death. They will not just be fired, they will be put to death if one prisoner escapes. So the centurion who is in charge of these people is left with another decision to make. And you might think, like, it's an easy one, but it's not an easy one. Because it's his job to deliver these prisoners to Rome. And to watch them, to make sure they don't escape. But the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. And so he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow. Some on planks and some on debris from the ship. In this way, everyone safely reached the shore. And that's how we end chapter 27. With the second opportunity for the centurion to make the right decision. This time he gets a chance to redeem himself. And this is a even more important decision than the one he made that got them shipwrecked in the first place. He has to decide whether they're going to kill the prisoners so that none of them have the ability to escape. But somewheres between first being captured and when he was allowed to go see his friends speaks to the character of Paul, that he was able to win favor of the centurion, that he was able to get him to listen to him as a prisoner. He was able to see that he was a man who genuinely did believe in God, that he did live in faith and to ultimately trust him that God did send a messenger and did tell him that everything was going to be all right. The centurion has to put his faith in that and has to trust in the words of a prisoner. And because of devastation, we've seen that that prisoner took leadership. You see, that leadership was not about power and control, because Paul didn't have any. That leadership was about servitude and saving people's lives in the moments where they needed it the most. And it was as a prisoner, as a centurion, or as a prisoner, and as a servant, that he was able to be more effective in his ministry than a centurion was. A man of great noble character and great praise, even from New Testament believers. What I learned from this story was that things don't always go according to plan. And although things aren't going according to plan for Paul, he is very much in the will of God. And what I learned from that is spiritually, metaphorically, the storms that we face, the hardships that we go through, the times we feel like we're on a metaphorically sinking ship. Is unavoidable. But that does not mean just because we're on this sinking ship, just because things are hard, just because we're facing trials and tribulations, that God's will is still not being done in us. And even despite the disobedience of others, maybe ourselves, God's will is still being done and still being used in the midst of the storm. And that very thing that was meant to destroy you, that very thing that you thought would kill you, that would be the end, that would pull you away from God, ends up bringing you closer, making you stronger, making you endure, making you trust him. Acts chapter 27 used the word gracefulness. Not just grace, but gracefulness. And God is full of grace. That means is that he showed grace before. He's showing grace now, and he's going to show grace again. Which means he was with us then. It's coming from a guy who was in 3 shipwrecks and 3 trials and was completely innocent and accused and beaten and robbed. That God was with me then. He's with me now, and he's going to be with us in the future, despite what we face. Despite what we go through. Not dismissing the pain and suffering, but rather embracing it. Embracing, like Paul did, the prison ship, to basically almost volunteer to be a prisoner. and using that opportunity of his trial to not just defend himself on being right, but to preach the gospel and to serve the very people that held him captive. He had compassion for them and understanding that they didn't believe what he believed in, but the hope that he had in for Jesus was not just for himself, but for them as well. And that's what I take away from Acts 27 the most. And then I'm going to go back and look at all that ship stuff, because that was pretty cool. I'm not going to lie. They actually use Acts 27 to study ancient sailing and to learn how they did it and the types of things. They will actually study the Bible to learn how they lived. Now I want to tell you about a time I faced a storm in my life. And it causes me to be completely vulnerable in this moment, but I think the testimony of God doing this in my life will speak and match up with the scriptures so that you can see that hope that was in the Bible and that story of overcoming is still being done because God's word is living and alive and working through us. So my mother was diagnosed with cancer a day after my birthday, March 24th, 2016. Never forget it. Because that was supposed to be my birthday party was supposed to be on the 24th. So when all our friends and family are gathering, they're not gathering for me, they're gathering for this announcement that my mother had cancer. It was stage 4 colon cancer, right from the diagnosis. And I remember just feeling angry, numb, scared, confused, just wanting to know how could I be there for my mom in this moment when I have a whole bunch of stuff going on in my life. And me and my mom had kind of put a plan together during this moment that she was going to go through chemo and everything like that. And I was going to pay the bills on the house, on our apartment that we were renting. And that in the fall, when she had completed her chemo and gone through this, I was going to give that apartment back to her exactly how it is, and everything was paid off, and I was going to go to Bible college. This was my plan. This was my hope. This is our plan we put together. Come the fall, my mother doesn't get better. She gets worse. And we're still, to be completely vulnerable, we know this is stage 4. We know this is bad. We know nothing's going to be the same as it was before. But our hope is that through treatments, through chemo, that they would still keep my mother alive. That this life is miserable, but it's life nonetheless. But come September, my mother says to me, hey, I want you to go with lunch with me and our pastor. And I'm really, really busy. And normally, even with cancer, my mom would say, okay, yeah, go finish what you're doing, and then we'll talk later, even with cancer. But this time, she said, no. I really want you to be there. And I knew this was different because my mother had never pleaded with me to go out with her for lunch. We either did or we didn't. But this time she said, yeah. And we're eating there. This is where I think the storm comes in, believe it or not, in my life. because it is at that meeting at lunch with the pastor and her that she says, I want to explain something to you. I am not going to live much longer. And you have this plan with me, but now you have to have this plan without me. Hardest words I've ever heard in my life, and spiraled me into a deep depression. And then at this meeting, she begins to plan out funeral arrangements and how things would go, and how she wanted things to be kind of distributed. Something is very important to me. And it has been very important to me ever since you came to faith. So I want you to continue going to church. I want you to continue what you're doing. I want you to continue preaching no matter what happens or how bad it gets. In fact, I want you to give a message at the funeral. And we started planning that out and planning how it would go. Those are not the plans I would have had. But that's how it went. And I promise you, I had every reason, according to man, to be bitter, to be angry, to be upset, to be mad at God, to be mad at life, to be hopeless in that situation, and to give up all things, and to just hurt in that moment. But my mother didn't want that. And because she knew that this is why we believe. We don't believe in God for our lives to get better. We actually don't really need God. We could just go to college, invest, right? But it's in these times, in this moment, this is why we believe. The pain, the sorrow that you will face without God. But we believe in God because we don't have to face these things alone. And although we will forever lose people, we will never lose the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. And that's the message of Acts 27.